When she gave birth to black children, he threw her out. 10 years later, everything changed. The maternity ward buzzed with activity as nurses shuffled from room to room. Inside one of the quieter rooms, Linda clutched her husband Thomas's hand as a contraction ripped through her body. The pain was excruciating, but the anticipation of meeting her babies, their twin boys, kept her pushing through. "Almost there, Linda," the doctor encouraged, his voice steady. "One more push." Sweat beaded her forehead as she bore down with every ounce of strength she had left. Then, the room filled with the sound of a baby's first cry. Linda collapsed back on the bed, her chest heaving as the nurse handed her the first boy, wrapped snugly in a blanket. "He's perfect," Linda whispered, tears streaming down her face. But there was no time to linger. Moments later, the second baby made his way into the world, his wail just as strong. Exhaustion turned to joy as Linda looked at the two tiny faces she and Thomas had created. She glanced at Thomas, expecting to see the same wonder in his eyes. But his expression wasn't one of joy. It was confusion. His brow furrowed as he stared at the second baby, who had a noticeably darker complexion. "Linda." His voice was sharp, cutting through the fragile moment. "What is this?" Linda blinked, her joy giving way to disbelief. "What do you mean? They're our sons." "That's not possible," Thomas hissed, his voice low but venomous. "Look at him." The room seemed to freeze as Linda tried to process his words. The nurse shifted uncomfortably, and even the doctor looked away, sensing the tension. "It's genetics," Linda said quickly, panic rising in her chest. "You know how traits can skip generations. My grandmother had darker skin." Thomas pulled his hand away, his face hardening. "Don't lie to me, Linda." The joy of the moment shattered like glass. Thomas left the room abruptly, leaving Linda clutching her newborn sons with tears of despair mingling with the ones of joy she'd felt just moments ago. But the heartbreak was only just beginning, and Linda had no idea how deeply it would cut. The ride home from the hospital was nothing like Linda had imagined. Thomas was silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Linda, seated in the back with the twins, tried to soothe their tiny cries while her own emotions boiled beneath the surface. She wanted to yell, to demand answers for his behavior, but the fear of what might come next kept her silent. Once they arrived home, Thomas wasted no time. He cornered Linda in the living room, his voice low but sharp. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "Whose children are they? Because they're not mine." Linda stood frozen, clutching Malik and Jordan tightly. "Thomas, they are your children. How can you even ask me that?" His face twisted into something unrecognizable. "Do you think I'm stupid? Look at them. Don't insult me, Linda." Her voice cracked as she pleaded, "This is about my grandmother's genes. You've seen pictures of her. This isn't something I can control." Thomas shook his head, stepping back as if even being near her was unbearable. "Get out," he said finally. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What?" "You heard me," he spat. "Take them and go. I'll send the divorce papers." Linda's knees buckled, but she caught herself. She stared at the man she'd loved, the man she thought would stand by her through anything, and realized he was gone. In his place stood a stranger, cold, unyielding, and filled with resentment. With no other choice, Linda packed a bag for herself and the boys. She left that same night, cradling the twins as they wailed in her arms. The door slammed shut behind her, a sound that seemed to echo her heartbreak. Linda moved in with her older sister in Cleveland, Ohio. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights, endless tears, and mounting frustration. Malik and Jordan's cries often mirrored her own, and she wondered how she would ever get through this. But Linda wasn't the type to wallow. Slowly, she began to rebuild. She found a small apartment and took on multiple jobs to make ends meet. Her days were grueling, but every time she looked at her boys, she found the strength to keep going. Malik and Jordan grew quickly, their personalities shining through even as toddlers. Malik was the quieter of the two, always observing, while Jordan had a knack for making everyone laugh. They became Linda's anchor, her reason to keep moving forward even when the weight of the world threatened to crush her. But Thomas's absence was a wound that refused to heal. Malik would often ask, "Why don't we have a daddy like the other kids?" Linda would force a smile and tell them, "We're a team, just the three of us. That's all we need." But deep down, Linda knew the questions wouldn't stop, and she had no idea that the answers were closer than she realized. 10 years passed, but the memories of that day in the hospital never left Thomas. He had remarried a few years after Linda left, but the marriage was strained. The guilt he carried was a silent weight, one he never shared with anyone, not even his new wife. He often wondered if he'd been wrong, but his pride kept him from reaching out. It wasn't until a routine checkup turned into a nightmare that Thomas's world began to unravel. Sitting in a sterile doctor's office in Cincinnati, he listened as the physician explained his diagnosis: early-stage kidney failure. Thomas's heart sank. He'd always been a healthy man, rarely visiting the doctor. Now, he was facing a future filled with treatments, medications, and uncertainty. "Do you have any family history of kidney issues?" the doctor asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not that I know of. My parents passed when I was young, and I was raised by my grandmother." The doctor nodded, scribbling on his clipboard. "It might be worth looking into. Sometimes these things are hereditary." That conversation lingered in Thomas's mind. For the first time in years, he started to dig into his family's history. He unearthed old photo albums, letters, and documents his grandmother had kept tucked away in a dusty attic. What he found stopped him cold. In a faded photograph from the 1930s, his grandmother stood next to a man with dark skin, his arm draped lovingly around her shoulders. Thomas flipped the picture over and saw the scrawled words, "June and William, 1933. William. The name didn't mean anything to Thomas at first, but as he sifted through more documents, he found a birth certificate. William wasn't just some acquaintance of his grandmother. He was her husband. The realization hit him like a freight train. His grandmother had been married to a black man. That meant his own genetic history was more complicated than he'd ever considered. His mind raced back to that day in the hospital, to the accusations he'd hurled at Linda. He had been wrong. Thomas spent the next few weeks grappling with the enormity of his mistake. The guilt he'd suppressed for a decade roared back to life, consuming him. He'd driven away the woman he loved and abandoned his own children, all because of his ignorance and pride. One evening, as he sat alone in his quiet house, he made a decision. It was time to find Linda. But reconnecting wouldn't be simple. He didn't even know where she was, or if she would want to see him. He hired a private investigator, providing the limited information he had: her name, the twins' names, and the city she had moved to after leaving him. Weeks later, the investigator returned with an address in Columbus, Ohio. Thomas stared at the piece of paper in his hands, his chest tightening. He knew this was his chance, his only chance, to make things right. But making amends wasn't just about showing up. It was about facing the pain he had caused and hoping for a forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. Thomas sat in his car outside Linda's modest house in Columbus, Ohio, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say 1,000 times during the 2-hour drive. But now, staring at the front door, his mind was blank. The house was small but well kept, with a basketball hoop in the driveway and a garden bursting with flowers. He imagined the life Linda had built here, a life he hadn't been part of for 10 years. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and approached the door. When the doorbell rang, Linda appeared with a dish towel slung over her shoulder. Her face froze when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked, her voice a mix of shock and caution. "I need to talk to you," Thomas said, his voice shaky. "Please." Linda hesitated but stepped aside, motioning him into the living room. The space was warm and inviting, filled with pictures of Malik and Jordan. Thomas's eyes lingered on a photo of the boys at what looked like a school recital. They were teenagers now, tall and confident, their smiles bright. His chest ached. "They're beautiful," he said softly, nodding toward the photos. Linda folded her arms. "They're all so smart, kind, and resilient. Everything you didn't stick around to see." Her words cut deep, but Thomas nodded. "I deserve that. I deserve worse. But Linda, I was wrong. About everything." He explained everything. The discovery of his grandmother's past, the truth about their family history, and the shame that had eaten away at him ever since. Linda listened in silence, her face unreadable. When he finished, she shook her head. "So, now that you know you were wrong, you think you can just waltz back into our lives? Do you have any idea what you put us through?" "I don't," Thomas admitted, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I had to tell you how sorry I am. And I want to meet them, Linda. Please. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to know my sons." Before Linda could respond, the sound of the front door opening broke the tension. Malik and Jordan walked in, their voices loud and playful, as they debated something about their basketball practice. When they saw Thomas, they stopped short. "Who's this?" Jordan asked, his eyes narrowing. Linda took a deep breath. "This is your father." The room went still. Malik and Jordan exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Malik stepped forward. "Our father." His voice was steady, but there was a hardness in his tone that Thomas couldn't ignore. Thomas stood, his hands trembling. "Yes. I know I don't deserve to be called that after everything I've done, but I am your father, and I'm here because I want to try to make things right." Jordan crossed his arms. 10 years. You didn't care about us for 10 years. Why now?" Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. "Because I was wrong, and I was a coward. I let my pride ruin everything, and I'm so sorry." The boys didn't respond right away. Jordan looked at Linda, as if searching her face for guidance. Malik stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on Thomas. "You don't get to just show up and expect everything to be okay," Malik finally said. "You weren't there when we needed you. Mom did everything for us. She's the reason we're okay." Thomas nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "I know, and I can't undo the past. But if you'll let me, I want to try to be here now." The room was heavy with silence. Finally, Linda spoke. "Boys, why don't you go upstairs for a bit? I need to talk to him alone." Reluctantly, they obeyed, casting wary glances at Thomas as they left the room. Linda turned back to Thomas, her eyes flashing with anger and pain. "You don't get to just decide you're ready to be a father. This isn't about you. It's about them." "I know," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "And I'll do whatever it takes to earn their trust, even if it takes the rest of my life." Linda studied him for a long moment before sighing. "They'll make that decision, not me. But if you're serious about being part of their lives, you need to be prepared for how hard it's going to be." Thomas nodded. "I am. I'll do whatever it takes." But earning back his family's trust would be harder than he ever imagined. And the journey was only beginning. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance. Thomas showed up every Saturday, as Linda had agreed, to spend time with Malik and Jordan. At first, the boys kept their distance. They sat stiffly at the dining table during lunches, their responses to Thomas's questions clipped and guarded. Linda often hovered nearby, ready to step in if needed, but mostly observing how her sons handled the situation. Thomas didn't push. He brought small gifts, books he thought Malik might like, basketball gear for Jordan. But he quickly realized that material things weren't the way into their hearts. What they needed was consistency. So every Saturday, he showed up. Rain or shine, he arrived at their door, ready to listen, to apologize again if necessary, and to be present in whatever way they would let him. One afternoon, after weeks of silence, Malik finally spoke. "Why'd you really leave?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with an edge that made Thomas's chest tighten. Thomas set his coffee cup down, meeting Malik's eyes. "Because I was a fool," he said honestly. "I let my pride and ignorance blind me to the truth. And instead of trying to understand, I ran. I ran from you, from your mom, from everything." Malik studied him, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once, a small but significant gesture. Jordan, on the other hand, took longer. He remained distant, often excusing himself from the room when Thomas was around. But one Saturday, as they were shooting hoops in the driveway, Jordan broke the silence. "You think showing up now makes up for everything?" he asked, his tone challenging. Thomas paused, lowering the ball. "No, it doesn't, and I don't expect it to. But I'm here because I want to try. I want to be your dad, if you'll let me." Jordan bounced the ball a few times, his expression hard. "We don't need you. Mom raised us. She did everything." "She did," Thomas agreed. "And she did an incredible job. I don't want to take anything away from that. I just want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me." Jordan didn't respond, but he didn't leave either. They finished their game in silence, and when it was over he muttered, "Maybe you can come next week too." It wasn't much, but it was a start. For Linda, watching all of this unfold was bittersweet. She saw the effort Thomas was making, and part of her wanted to believe he had changed, but the scars of the past ran deep. One evening, as they sat on the porch while the boys were inside, Linda finally spoke her mind. "You hurt me more than I ever thought possible," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I'll never forget that. But the boys deserve to know their father, even if it's taken you this long to step up." Thomas nodded, his eyes shining with tears. "I know I can't erase what I did, but I'm not going anywhere this time. I'll be here for them, no matter what." Months turned into a year, and slowly the walls began to come down. Malik invited Thomas to his high school debate competition, and Jordan asked for his help with a science project. The small moments began to add up, stitching together a fragile but growing bond. On a warm summer evening, the family gathered in the backyard for a barbecue. It was the first time in over a decade that they were all together, laughing and sharing stories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Malik looked at Thomas and said, "You're not there yet, but you're trying. And I think that matters." Jordan nodded, adding, "Just don't mess it up again." Thomas smiled, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. "I won't. I promise." For Linda, it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about moving forward. Watching her sons begin to heal gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Sometimes, redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about owning it and working toward a better future. And for Thomas, Linda, Malik, and Jordan, that future was finally within reach. This story reminds us that pride and ignorance can shatter relationships, but accountability and perseverance can pave the way for healing. It's never too late to make things right, if you're willing to put in the work and face the pain you've caused. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and connect us.